thank you all for joining us today for this webinar organized by the Mobile Gaming Research Lab. It's our spring lecture series in 2021. And my name is Adriana de Souza Silva. I'm a professor of communication at NC State University and the director of the Mobile Gaming Research Lab. Housed in the Department of Communication, the Mobile Gaming Lab focuses on the study of all types of games that are portable and can be played while moving around. And it's easy about to think of mobile games today with the worldwide success of Pokemon Go and thousands of other mobile games and location-based mobile games, but actually mobile games are much older than smartphones. We can trace back their origin to devices such as Mattel Auto Racer and Nintendo Game Boy in the 70s and 80s, which I used to play some when I was a child. And in the event today, we are actually celebrating the release of the Retro Mobile Gaming Database, which is a resource on our website that allows users to search for historic mobile games from the mid-70s until 2008 by several different search criteria. We actually would welcome contributions to the database. I'm gonna put the link to the database here on the chat, and I just wanted to show you very quick the resource on our website. So here you can connect and you can actually search by games for different years, different kinds of connectivity, genres and hardware. And in order to do that, you just need to log in to register and create an account. So feel free to contribute. This is just an announcement, and join me in the organization of this event today is Reagan Glover Reipsey, a PhD candidate at the Communication, Rhetoric, and Digital Media CRDM program at NC State University. Reagan will be responsible for taking questions from the audience and asking questions to the speakers after the talk. So while you're welcome to start asking questions during the talk, we're going to leave all questions to the end. And please, to ask a question, don't write on the chat. You should write on the Q&A box that you can see on your screen. So the format of this event will be as follows. After my introduction, Reagan will introduce the first speaker, Dr. Parisi, who will give a 10 to 15-minute talk. Then she will introduce our second speaker, Dr. Justin Grandinetti, who will also talk for about 10 to 15 minutes. And afterwards, we have about 10 minutes for a brief dialogue among the speakers. And in the last 20 minutes, we're gonna take questions from the audience. As I said, feel free to start sending questions now or any point during the talks, but we will wait to ask questions until the end. So with that, I will pass the word to Reagan.
Okay, hi everyone. Our first speaker today is Dr. David Parisi, who is an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the College of Charleston. His book, Archaeologies of Touch, investigates the past, present, and future of technologized touch. He co-edited the Haptic Media Studies issue of New Media and Society and has published extensively on the relationship between video games and the body, including articles like Games Interfaces as Disabling Infrastructures, Shocking Grasp towards a Rumble Control towards a Critical History of Touch Feedback in Video Games, and most recently, Dreaming and Doing Haptics. So with that said, we would like to welcome Dr. David Parisi to give his talk.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much to Adriana for the invitation to speak with you all today, and also to Reagan for the introduction. I'm really excited for the opportunity to dialogue with Justin today on mobile games. I expect we'll have a lot of crossover between our talks and a lot to take up during the discussion later on. My portion of the session this afternoon will address the issue of touch in mobile game interfaces with an emphasis on first on the cultural construction of touch through marketing discourse, and second on the mechanisms employed to feed data back via touch to mobile gamers. And I'll be interested throughout my talk in thinking about what the medical historian Robert Jute described in his book, A History of the Senses from Antiquity to Cyberspace, as the quote unquote use value of the senses in our current moment, while also locating that current moment in a broader historical context. With that in mind, I'll provide a quick methodological setup here by describing the way that media archaeology figures into my approach to mobile interfaces in general and mobile game interfaces in particular. This topic loops me back to work I did early in my career on the Touching is Good ad campaign for the Nintendo DS portable game system. So I thought it would be useful to open with a quote from the media archaeologist Frederick Kittler that's helped me operationalize my research on interfaces throughout my career. This is Kittler, and this quote has really sort of provided a methodological research program for me in the last 15 or so years. A compromise between engineers and salespeople regulates the degree to which sound from a TV set can be poor, movie images can be fuzzy, or a beloved voice on the telephone can be filtered. Our sense perceptions are the dependent variable of this compromise. Here, Kittler is urging us to attend to the material and the cultural simultaneously via the figures of the engineer and the salesperson. The engineer's task is to design technologies that accurately capture, store, and transmit data for the individuated senses, while the salesperson's task is to determine the price point at which these technologies can be viably brought to market. To put this reductively, the engineer creates new sensations while the salesperson creates demand for those new sensations. In my work, this has directed me to consider the way that salespeople or marketers articulate the value of touch technologies, often in highly instrumentalized terms, while also considering the role engineers play in designing the mechanisms responsible for producing tactile sensations. And there's a lot more we can discuss here about media archaeology and method, but in the interest of time, I'm going to examine two examples of the cultural construction of technologized touch in the marketing of touch-based mobile interfaces. So a couple of ads, if you're old enough to remember this, this Touching is Good campaign, a couple of ads from the campaign, and then a third, which I'm going to spend some time on. So this is, again, from Nintendo's Touching is Good campaign. And as you can see in this ad, the copy reads, "Touching is not good," or so we're told. "Please don't touch yourself, your nose, wet paint, that's it. Grandma's best china, you name it, you can't touch it." We think that's wrong. Why shouldn't you touch what you want? What if you could touch the games you play? What if you could make something jump or shoot or run just by touching it? Let's face it, touching the game means controlling the game. And when we say control, we mean precision control. One right touch and you're master of the universe. One wrong touch and you're toast. Forget everything you've ever been told and repeat after us. Touching is good. Touching is good. What we have in this ad is Nintendo pushing back on cultural prohibitions against touch, which are ultimately epistemic orientations away from touch toward other modes of sensory knowledge, and attempting to reactivate a neglected mode of knowing while also redefining touch as a means to control and mastery. A second, more recent example is from Apple's marketing materials for its Taptic Engine, which was basically a new mechanism used to generate haptic sensations in wearables and smartphones. And here's Apple. Here's the Taptic Engine, and here is Apple. We found a way to give technology a more human touch. Literally, it's called the Taptic Engine, a linear actuator inside the Apple Watch that produces haptic feedback. In less technical terms, it taps you on the wrist. Whenever you receive an alert or notification or perform a function like turning the digital crown or pressing down on the display, you feel a tactile sensation that's recognizably different for each kind of interaction. That idea of recognizably different is going to become important later on. Combined with subtle audio cues from the specially engineered speaker driver, the Taptic Engine creates discrete, sophisticated, and nuanced experience by engaging more of your senses. This is another theme that's going to be important later on, adding more senses. It also enables some entirely new, intimate ways to communicate for you to communicate with other Apple Watch wearers. You can get someone's attention with a gentle tap or send something as personal as your heartbeat. Taken together, the ads for these devices represent an attempt to redefine, revalorize, and reconstruct touch, articulating its value in a culture of mobile interfacing, information interfacing. They are representative of what I call the dream of haptics, an imaginary mobilized around touch-based human-computer interfaces that claims the widespread proliferation of touch feedback technologies will not merely layer a new form of information presentation onto extant audiovisual interfaces, but goes further to assert that this addition of touch will prove transformative and revolutionary, ushering in a new mode of interacting not just with computers, but with other networked communicative subjects, as we see in this ad for the Taptic engine. The claims made by proponents of these touch technologies are strikingly McLuhan-esque at times, suggesting that audiovisual interfaces have had the effect of unbalancing our sensorium and alienating us from our bodies. Essentially, the embrace and dominance of audiovisual media has caused a bodily disengagement, or a stuttering extension in McLuhan's terminology, of the sensorium. Touch-based computer interfaces, by weaving the body more fully into the process of human-computer interaction, allow us to regain our humanity by reconnecting with touch, often identified in this discourse as our most human sense. This is a theme that comes up repeatedly in the marketing literature for touch-based interfaces. In the dream of haptics, we regain our lost humanity by seamlessly fusing with touch's technological extensions. This dream of transforming our relationship to information through touch, however, originated in an earlier era. To provide some historical context, I'm going to quickly take us back to the 1950s, when psychologists began searching for new sensory pathways that they could use to transmit information. This passage from Frank Gildard, who would go on to establish a cutaneous communication lab at Princeton, nicely summarized the challenge they faced. Our eyes and our ears, Gildard wrote, are assaulted so continuously, such frequent and insistent demands are placed on them that the visual and auditory channels are seriously overburdened at times. Such an oversaturation leads quite naturally to the question of whether it is only vision and hearing that can serve in communication. In response to this challenge, researchers from a range of disciplines identified a host of possible uses for and advantages of relaying information through touch, which we can see summarized in this slide. And I'm not going to break these down here in the interest of time, but in going through the list, it's worth noting that already in 1960, they had anticipated many of the uses we would later find for communication through touch. Touch, in this conceptualization, was an instrument for more effective and efficient forms of information relay, a discrete information reception channel called into service in response to an increasingly overcrowded sensory environment. Despite being over half a century old, however, we have yet to fully realize the dream of haptics, although new devices and stimulation mechanisms are always promising to bring us closer to this imagined endpoint. So with my final move, I'll weave a consideration of materiality into this conversation. The Taptic engine represented an effort to improve the quality and nuance of mobile haptics, to move towards something like high definition haptics by increasing the size of the vibration mechanism employed in the mobile device. The haptics company Lofelt recently conducted a study of actuator size in smartphones with the results illustrated in this chart. In comparison to vibration actuators in Android handsets, Apple phones devote more device real estate to haptics. The ratio of actuator size to overall smartphone size reflects and embodies the priority device manufacturers give to touch feedback, echoing McLuhan's notion of sense ratios, the ratio among the different mediated senses. Actuator power and accuracy has to be balanced with other economic considerations. How much space does a given actuator take up in the device? How much weight does it add? How much power does it consume in normal operation? How expensive is it to produce or purchase? It's important to note that haptics, as much as we might think about it in these future-oriented terms, looking toward this eventual dream of haptics, very much exists currently as an industry engaged in large-scale industrial manufacturing, necessary to supply vibration actuators for the 1.5 billion or so smartphones sold every year. Premium or flagship phones often come with better quality actuators than less expensive handsets, meaning that they can produce sharper and more precise haptic sensations. Thinking of this in linguistic terms, it means that these premium devices can communicate in a greater range of haptic syllables, creating a wider range of haptic sensations. Quoting from Lofelt's report, we had previously found that the Taptic engine's resonant frequency is typically in the 110 to 130 hertz range, Android actuators do not typically go below 160 hertz, and many are in the 200 to 300 hertz range too high to produce subtle haptic effects. Here we can see how Kittler's directive, quoted at the outset, to consider our sense perceptions as the dependent variables in the compromise between engineers and salespeople, is expressed in the process of actuator design and marketing. Our haptic experiences with mobile devices and with mobile games are configured through this process of negotiation around actuator size, power consumption, and expense. The expressive possibilities of mobile haptics, the tactile sensations smartphones and wearables can and can't produce, emerge out of this process. And I know I haven't talked a ton about games specifically here, but I just want to flag that I think the success of smartphone gaming and the success of smartphone haptics are intricately linked in this marketing process, right? So smartphone haptics represent one of the most crucial aspects of smartphone mobile gaming. However, in embracing and taking advantage of these expressive possibilities has been held back by both the technical know-how needed to design haptics for mobile games and a lack of appreciation on the part of players for these new haptic vocabularies. So I'll close with two questions that we can hopefully take up in the discussion. One, what if the interface reads a language its programmers can't write? And two, what if the interface speaks in a language its user doesn't understand? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Parisi, for that really insightful talk. Next up, we're going to have Dr. Justin Grandinetti, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies and affiliate faculty in the School of Data Science at UNC Charlotte. Dr. Grandinetti graduated from North Carolina State's Communication Rhetoric and Digital Media program in 2019. His scholarship is at the intersection of mobile media, streaming media, big data, and AI, with an emphasis on how these technologies contribute to a mobile personalization of space. His work has appeared in journals that include Information Communication and Society, Critical Studies in Media Communication, and Surveillance in Society. So with that said, we welcome you, Dr. Grandinetti, to give your talk.
Thank you, Reagan. I appreciate it. You know, much like David, I want to thank Adriana for inviting me to this presentation, Reagan for helping with the organization, and David for being here to talk to, as well as everyone else. I really appreciate you all taking time out of a beautiful April afternoon to get on another Zoom call. I know Zoom University has been kind of a fatiguing thing for all of us a little bit this past year, but hopefully this will be somewhat interesting. At least I'll try and make it so. So my presentation today, I want to talk a little bit, continuing this theme of mobile games, about Pokemon Go, augmented reality, and digital memory. I think here, I'm working on a project where I'm currently thinking about these intersections between augmented reality, or at least in terms of the killer app for augmented reality that spawned a ton of imitators, and that is Pokemon Go. Thinking about that intersection between augmented reality and memory. And so for this presentation, I wanted to bring in that media archaeology focus and perhaps how that can fit in with this topic. And considering the fact that Pokemon Go and really contemporary mobile AR is not really a technology that we typically associate with memory. But I think this is relevant when considering the convergence of technologies that make augmented reality like Go possible, and how there's a strong current of data collection, storage, and processing, and perhaps how this app functions as what Catherine Hales would call a cognitive assemblage. So I wanted to dive in here and start out with a question, or I guess a series of questions, and something just to keep in mind, and that's, where were you when you first played Pokemon Go, and how do you remember? Well, for me, I was able to go back to some smartphone photos and screenshots that I took from summer of 2016 at the height of Pokemon Go, Pokemania. On the left here is actually the first time I was successfully able to log onto the game. Those of you who wanted to be an early adopter might have had a similar experience of not being able to get on for days, but this was finally, I got the real loading screen outside my apartment complex and I was psyched. The middle screenshot is a particularly good find early on, this Dragonair I was very excited about. It was actually the first time that I paid for Pokeballs because I really wanted to catch it so badly and I did not have enough. So certainly an intense memory there. And the final one, kind of humorous, walking down Hillsborough Street in Raleigh playing the game. I guess team instinct territory there, keep walking. Luckily, I was a part of that team, so I didn't have to keep walking. But, territory wars, a big part of Pokemon Go there. But when it comes to memory, I can also engage with game logs, which I think have always existed in some form in this game. Certainly activity on the app is logged and tracked by Niantic, the parent company of Pokemon Go, for their own purposes. But some of these logs have become more transparent over time in terms of the Pokemon you've caught and when, different kinds of location information, how far you've walked in the game, different gifts that you've sent to people. And also, I can look at the data tagged to the screenshots and photos I have associated with the game as well. Our smartphone photos certainly have a lot of memory and data storage attached to them as well. Maybe, though, you're a big social media person and you shared some of your Pokemon Go experience online. These aren't actually my own screenshots or memories of playing, but there's some early grabs of people playing the game. And I think when posted to social media, our memories, our photos become parts of new kinds of digital becomings via social media machine learning, algorithmic suggestion. Certainly social media pulls us into remember this time a couple years ago when you did something, and Pokemon Go can certainly be a part of that. So how does memory and storage and augmented reality start to come together in different ways? Well, I think memory and storage are often conflated, although they are definitely some different things, right? We hear this metaphor of the brain as a computer. I think that's something that's existed our lifetimes. But how memory actually works in a biological sense within the brain, kind of a little different than technological storage, right? Neuron cells are communicating through different synaptic connections and neurotransmitter chemicals, but different even than a biological sense, how memory functions also takes some attention to the philosophical. Memory is something ontological. It's a relationship between the past and the present, or in other terms, between being and becoming. The past is being. We can't go into the past and we can't change it. But the past is also inexorably connected to the present through memory. And sometimes our memories are exteriorized through storage technologies. I think there's a lot to unpack when it comes to memory, and certainly people have spent books and books about these topics. But I think for the sake of this presentation, memory is something human, sure, but it's also something that's exteriorized in culture and technologies through storage. And I think as such, memory is something temporary, but also lasting, something human and non-human, it's something cultural and technological. And so how do contemporary forms of mobile augmented reality fit in? Are these augmented reality apps really storage media associated with memory? Well, I think perhaps one way to tackle this question is to think about media archaeological approaches, and David certainly got into this in his presentation as well. Without spending too much time here, just to keep it short, I think media archaeology is sometimes used by critical scholars that are looking for a method, right? Like one way of doing things, kind of a paint by the numbers way of doing scholarship. But realistically, media archaeology takes a lot of different forms. It's not associated with one single orthodoxy or one single approach. And typically, and David brought this up in his presentation, it involves attention to both the material and discursive. The quick and dirty here, the discursive, usually associated with Michel Foucault. Foucault is interested in how the discursive is related to systems of dispersion, concepts, thematic choices, techniques, and rules that govern a creation of regularity. So our material bodies, our events, our institutions, they're all conditioned by discursive formations. Foucault's archaeology of knowledge, accordingly, I think, interrogates the familiar in order to understand that normative and institutional relations are complex. They're not merely intrinsic characteristics. And so I think there's a theme of looking at continuities, but also disruptions over time, how things kind of emerge and reemerge over a period of time. As David also points out, Friedrich Kittler someone associated with media archaeology as well, but more of a materialist techno hardware focus. And so Kittler's archaeological mix is often narrowing attention to questions of how media determine what data are stored, selected, and processed, and how media make possible new forms of knowledge and epistemologies. I think Alexander and Monea and Jeremy Packer really elucidate how these two things come together, the discursive and the material, when they mention that technical media arise out of our distributed discursive networks. So our bodies of knowledge, our objects, and our techniques, but then they start to crystallize, cut their roots, become mobile, intermix, and recombine, right? So I think the discursive and material are both quite relevant to media archaeology. I think overall media archaeology, we're thinking of being sort of discontent with canonized narratives of media, and we're working to disrupt some linear narratives and try and tell a more complete story or kind of add to the stories of media's transformations. So like any other technology, you can find histories of augmented reality in a more linear fashion. And I think there are some important dates here. Donna Berryman writes that augmented reality is a technology that overlays digital information or objects on places in the real world for the purpose of enhancing user experience. And she traces the origins of augmented reality to World War II, when the British military developed the Mark 8 airborne interception radar gun sighting project. Can't say that one 5 times fast at all. But this project was basically developing a technology that's displaying radar information on the windshield of a fighter plane so you can identify friends and foes. 1968, kind of another key date. You have Ivan Sutherland with his graduate students building what's recognized as the first augmented reality system, which was some kind of massive heads-up display. But we see a lot of experimentation via military, space, and university experiments in augmented reality over the next couple of decades. But in another way, I think there's a kind of shorter connection when it comes to augmented reality and gaming, and particularly mobile and smartphone gaming. Something like AR Quake in 2002 was not a mobile game, but certainly a gamified iteration of augmented reality. Things like AR Tennis from Nokia phones in 2005, Ingress in 2012, which is really a direct predecessor to Pokemon Go. Now I have Ingress Prime up there, or even things like AR promotions for something like Star Wars Day in 2016, really kind of gamifying the buying experience. So I think here we start to see some continuities and some disruption from prior forms of AR. We're starting to see augmenting reality through different displays, but also AR as entertainment, as gamification, and as kind of wrapped up in profit generation as well. So I think when we're thinking about contemporary mobile forms of AR, we're talking about not just one technology that has evolved over time, but realistically, a number of interlocking features of contemporary smartphones. This includes something like GPS, global positioning systems, digital mapping, digital camera technologies, geographic classifications, so climate, water, land, the type of area you're in determines what kind of Pokemon you see, for instance. Things like a clock, night and day matter in the game. The accelerometer, which is a directional technology that's key to our smartphones. Mobile web access and infrastructures, and of course, even social media when we start to share some of these posts and how our memories become wrapped up in algorithmic suggestions and machine learning. So then I think what augmented reality has become from sort of this military radar-oriented overlay origins to what it is today is certainly not something that's all that neat or linear. I think it requires attention to a lot of different technological histories. And I think ultimately why storage and memory matters to something like Pokemon Go is in large part due to our contemporary techniques. Our digital media era, our big data-driven era, data collection, storage, and processing is so key to everything we do. Apps use this data to cultivate a very personalized relationship to space, but they also do this because it makes money for companies, right? It's that monetization of time and space as well. And so this means logging our info, some things we can see and some things we can't. And these data points, these memories that are stored are also part of how we gain a strong connection to the game and our account. And so To take this all together, I think it's better to think of contemporary mobile AR as what Catherine Hales would call a cognitive assemblage. Here, cognition is defined as a process of interpreting information in context that connected with meaning. So I think certainly memory and storage is important here. Hales writes that a cognitive assemblage operates through contextual relations at multiple levels and sites, with boundaries fluctuating as conditions and context change. Cognitive assemblages emphasize cognition as the common element among parts and as the functionality by which parts connect. And so I think thinking about cognitive relations across human and non-human systems is important. And in this case, something that contemporary augmented reality entails as well. And so, this was just a very brief overview of some of my thinking here in relation to augmented reality like Pokemon Go and memory. But it's also what it looks like maybe to turn a little bit of an archaeological eye to contemporary AR. We can think about some of the discursive origins and material transformations over time, but also how contemporary AR is bound up in the logics of our contemporary conjuncture, right? We live in a computational and data-driven era. We see a lot of monetization through data collection, storage, and processing. And augmented reality, like Pokemon Go, fosters a very personalized relationship to space. And I think memory and storage is key here. With that in mind, I think Pokemon Go is well thought of as a cognitive assemblage, but what comes next is not a given, right? That's a big part of thinking about this transformations of media forms over time. Pokemon Go, for instance, has launched new features like scanning Pokestops. So more data, more storage, perhaps more moments of collective memory. There's also been some experiments in mixed reality via the HoloLens, which I have an example of up there. Pokemon, of course, is a part of that to kind of sell the cuteness to people. But I think to this end, media archaeology is important to understanding the complex lineage of technologies like augmented reality. How we can understand different historical currents, continuities, and disruptions over time, thinking about how we got to where we are. What are some of the logics and goals of our socio-technical relations that emerge and reemerge over different time periods? And finally, thinking about augmented reality as part of how we sense and experience and move through the world. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Grandinetti, for such a fantastic talk. And thank you to both of you for being here today with us. So the next portion of our event will be Dr. Grandinetti and Dr. Parisi speaking with one another, having a brief dialogue before we open up to the audience for some additional questions. And again, to the audience, if you're listening, just feel free to use the Q&A instead of the chat in order to ask questions, and we'll get to those in just a moment. So Dr. Grandinetti, would you like to start with asking a question?
Oh, sure. Let me actually pull up that sheet. Give me a moment. If you have the question, I could ask it by proxy, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no problem. So when we were all talking last week, one of the questions that Dr. Grandinetti came up with was that the two of you both noted the wide variety of forms media archaeology can take. And what advice, Dr. Parisi, would you give scholars who are interested in taking up media archaeological approaches?
Thanks for this question. I love this question because I love to talk about media archaeology as a method, because my own encounter with it, I think, came before before we got a lot of the more detailed and nuanced explanations that Justin pointed to at the start of his talk. So in my graduate work, I very much struggled with that question of what it means to do media archaeology. I didn't know when I was doing media archaeology versus when I was doing media history, because I didn't know what media archaeology was. And the fact that UC Paris had to write a book called "What is Media Archaeology," I think suggests that it was a struggle for a lot of us, in that moment, and still is. So for me, what it did with my research is it oriented me first to thinking about structures of perception, the way that structures of perception are normalized and fixed through media technology. So media technologies embody resolutions to epistemic questions about how we know and encounter the world. And what I did with this in my research was I used this to try to challenge the borders of what we considered media. So if you look back at media archaeological research, a lot of it tends to take for granted this notion that media are means of extending, either seeing or hearing, right? So media archaeology, one strain of media archaeology originates in film studies. Film studies is really interested in historically contextualizing the rise of cinema. And to go back to something that Justin mentioned, in particular, disrupting those linear narratives around the rise of cinema and basically like blowing those up. It's sort of like a resistive act by historians of cinema to try to do something different with the history of cinema. For me, when I came to media archaeology and was trying to apply these methods to touch, this critique of linear narrative, I found to be completely useless in my work, right? For touch media, we had no linear narrative. So the first thing that I had to do in my work was try to build a linear narrative that, like, hopefully I'm not necessarily like endorsing linear narratives, but I'm saying that we didn't have one to push back against. So that was the first thing that I tried to do with my work, was establish something like a genealogy of haptic media, so that we could basically define this this field of study. So I think that in terms of tangible and concrete advice, one of the things that media archaeology has done for me is it's encouraged me to think really flexibly about what we consider media on the one hand. And then on the other hand, it's also encouraged me to think really flexibly about the types of evidence that we use to inform our claims about media history. So is it discursive evidence? Is it material evidence? I look in my work a lot at patents. I look at more conventional things that we use in doing history, like newspaper articles, popular press coverage of technologies. But it's really sort of encouraged me to think flexibly about the types of evidence that inform the claims I make around media. It's encouraged me to think about the way that media function as normalizing and normative structures to shape our modes of perception. And I think I've talked for too long now, so I'll stop there. Can I fire one back now? Is that how this works?
Yes.
Sure.
Okay. So, and Justin, I know this is in the moment we're in, this might be a difficult question to answer. But I'm wondering if you can talk at all about how mobile AR games have responded in the last year to the immobility brought on by the pandemic. And I say this, like, there's a little bit of background here. I used to be an Ingress player. And for the last year, I've been getting like bombed with spammy messages from Ingress talking about how they've redesigned Ingress to be like playable from home, and I've ignored all of them. So I'm just really sort of curious just to hear how these less popular like Ingress and more popular like Pokemon Go games have responded to this immobility.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I mean, because when it comes to mobile games, there's that huge element of the mobile, right? You've got to be out to go and play them. And realistically, I mean, anyone who's played these games know that not all spaces are created equal, right? It's not just about playing the games, it's about playing the games in certain spaces, and they tend to be more urbanized spaces, more densely populated spaces, or even spaces like a shopping mall or something. And that's not really all kinds of places we're really meant to be this past year. And so I know, for something like Pokemon Go or just any kind of augmented reality apps that really rely on different techniques of monetization, it seems like they've really kind of embraced this, like, you can play where you are, play from the comfort of your home. It seemed like Pokemon Go specifically added some new features to complete some tasks where you are. From what I've seen, they have like more ability to give out gifts. So instead of fostering mobility, perhaps fostering just kind of more connectivity, right? Like, you're still interacting with people, even if you're not out and about interacting with people. I think they tried some like things in like remote raids so that you didn't have to be at a particular location. And I think there were also some features about being able to initiate battles anywhere. And so it's kind of an interesting thing, right? Like cutting down on some of the ability to have to go places, but still trying to foster like, hey, you can still do things with friends, which I think is a big part of the game. From what I've also seen, they cut down on some of the incubation times and increased drops and increased environments and like doubled items duration. So if you wanted to like lure Pokemon in with like incense or something like that, that lasted a little bit longer. So I think it seems to be like anything they can do to get you to keep playing, even if it's probably not as fun as being out and about playing. From what I've seen, there's possibilities that some of this would stay permanent over time, but I think some of it might have also already been rolled back in different ways as we start kind of opening up for better or worse, right? So yeah, it's sort of interesting to see games that are designed to be mobile, to be played in densely populated spaces, to be played with other people, what kind of friction that comes across when we have a pandemic that's really antithetical to playing the games in the first place. But the companies like Niantic, they want your money one way or another, so they're going to try and find a way, even if it means canceling some of the events or kind of changing how we do those things.
Thanks.
Okay, so at this point, we're going to now transition to questions from the public, and we have quite a few already. So the first one comes from Nick Taylor, who says, "Hey both, lovely talks by both. Wondering how would you advise students on how to do, as in like how to start a media archaeological project? What is the archive for something like Pogo or Pokemon Go or Nintendo DS, for instance?"
Do you want to, I could jump in and give it a start. I mean, I thought David explaining kind of what he was doing in terms of like how he got started with his work is important, right? So I think looking at patents is an interesting way, kind of looking at different ways where technology has originated, or looking at kind of what people were saying about them. I think advertisements that David brought up in his presentation are a really great way to access some of the discourses around technology. What are the promises of this technology? How have some of those promises changed over time? But yeah, I mean, what the archive looks like in a digital era, I think is so interesting and sprawling, and can entail a lot of different modes of entry. I think, anything that allows you to focus on some of those discursive positionings of technology, but also like how it has changed in a material way as well. That makes the archive kind of broad, but I don't know if David, you had more to say about something like that.
Yeah, just a little bit. I mean, I think to go back to some of what we were talking about earlier, the first challenge is to figure out what you mean by media archaeology, right? And I do think that is a question that because it's a practice that takes so many different variants, you need to figure out what you're trying to do with the project. Like, what is your intervention? And I think that intervention that you're trying to make is going to determine where you locate that archive. So that question of what constitutes a normative discursive formation is going to maybe push you one place instead of another. The other thing too that I found really helpful in my work, and this is, I don't know how helpful this will be in terms of advice, but finding a thread and then just tugging at it and seeing where that goes. And I was able to follow particular discursive threads back, in my case, back into the 1700s, where when I started this project, the project that became my book, I thought it was a project about, from the 1990s on. And as I started looking for an archive, I started building an archive that eventually got bigger and bigger, and it took me back further than I expected to go. So I always ask students, where's the surprise? Where's room for surprise in your research? And I think that's one way to build room for surprise into your research, is by building those spaces of discovery.
I think that pulling at the thread is a really great way to put it. And I think something that is probably good to think about when you want to do some kind of archaeological work is you're not endeavoring to tell like the complete or the whole story, right? Like, you're just adding to the story, right? You're adding something that's maybe surprising or forgotten, or that is relevant, that really hasn't been talked about. You're sort of disrupting those canonized narratives in different ways. And so I don't think you have to set out to like necessarily blow everything wide open, or necessarily like change everything completely with your work. I think it's part of, a larger process. You're adding a piece to a story about media's changes over time. And yeah, I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to take on everything. You can pull one thread and kind of see where that goes.
Okay, so our next question comes from Samuel Tobin, who begins by describing that he spent quite a bit of time during the pandemic running and hiking in the woods, which also means that this person has spent a lot of time lost in the woods. And so thinking a lot about memory and being lost in mobile technology, so much of being lost on a trail is about failed moments of recognition, and that recognition is often rooted in touch, maybe proprioceptive footfalls, slippery places, and so forth. And so the eventual question is, how can we think about memory and mobility and the ways in which moving through space with and without AR and mobile media is also moving through and with and against memory?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great question. I guess when it comes to something like moving through space with a contemporary digital technology, there's all kinds of ways that there's pervasive tracking that's on, whether we kind of acknowledge it or not, right? Like you almost have to really opt out of creating that digital trail, that kind of storage with what you're doing. I think when you're playing a game like Pokemon Go, I mean, a big part of the reason why I've been working on this project is my RA this semester is very interested in Pokemon Go, and she wanted to write something about it. And one of her big things is like, she has all these associations with place, right? Where it's like, oh, I remember this particular Pokestop because that's where my husband proposed to me or something, right? So I think a lot of times our strongest memories really are location oriented, right? And even kind of like bringing back some of the things that I had, like some of the screenshots, they might not be things that I like actively kind of conjure up on a daily basis. But when I see those screenshots, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that, it comes kind of flooding back to you, right? It's that moment of being and becoming kind of come together, that moment of past and present. And it really is focused around a location oriented memory when it comes to augmented reality games. So I think there's a very strong connection there between like, different spaces and places and memories.
I'll give an incredibly like autoethnographic answer to this question. One of the things that I noticed in my whatever couple of year obsession with Ingress was how much it changed my relationship to like local space. So in my suburb and the island I live on, it took me like Ingress took me to places I never would have gone to. It sort of took me to like far nestled away portals, like out on roads that I would not have driven down. And what's interesting, like coming through that on the other side, like going from playing the game intensely and obsessively to not playing the game anymore at all, is how much that couple of year period is, my memories of that couple of year period are intensely linked to those different spaces I explored only around the game. And then how much when I traveled and played Ingress during my travels, how much my orientation to space when I traveled was instrumentalized. It was sort of rooted in like portal locations in a way that actually sort of made me, it was one of the reasons that I quit playing. It made me kind of uncomfortable, like how much that experience of play it would push me to go different places, but I would encounter those places through the filter of the game, and then feel like I was never really seeing or encountering them. So it had a very complicated relationship with between space and place and the instrumentalist orientation that I found immensely valuable to teach me about the function of these AR games, but also like made me stop playing them eventually.
Yeah, I mean, to think something like that is a great example of it. Goes to show you, I guess, one way of putting it was like how striated our mobility is in different ways, right? Like I think about first month of playing Pokemon Go, like around where I lived in my apartment complex, there were trails, and I would walk these trails maybe multiple times a day as a way to just get out and go for a walk. And I remember playing Pokemon Go, it took me off of them into like some different locations, like you were saying, David, like places in my neighborhood or different side streets and things that I had never gone down before. But in a lot of ways, it's kind of like a different kind of striating, right? Like it was still kind of taking me toward different locations, toward a certain path, right? And I was seeing these things very much filtered through the augmented reality of the game one way or the other, right? Like it just saw these as like another place to recharge on items and stuff. So, but it is interesting, like, how we move through space and, the kind of paths we choose or we think we choose. Maybe we just kind of go on them because they're a pre-constructed path one way or the other.
Okay, so our next question is a bit more open-ended, and it comes from Peter Glavitsky. Apologies, Peter, if I did not pronounce your name correctly, but what do you think media archaeology should study or study more about that it hasn't already yet studied? And so Peter says that he's still processing a lot of the good connections that you all brought up during your talks and would love to know more. And thank you.
You want to take this on? I mean, should study, I think, anything that you think is interesting, right? Like a big part of my dissertation was bringing in media archaeology to studying mobile streaming media because I thought it was interesting, right? Like, something like Pokemon Go, I kind of started studying or looking at because it was just such a big deal. And, it wasn't something that like for a month, I was very intensely into it, but I think I was more into its implications and kind of what it was as like this killer app for AR as really something where people started to see AR for the first time. And so for me, that's just an interesting question. It's like, well, where does this come from, right? Like, what are the origins of something like this? And certainly, you can get on Google and search for something like that. But, sometimes linear narratives and timelines don't tell us the full story. Sometimes there's little pieces of history and little moments that are lost, little traces of technologies that are important. And, one of the things that I wanted to bring up in this presentation is our contemporary AR, like Pokemon Go, what we see as AR now is very indebted to a lot of different smartphone features, many of which were not a part at all of original forms of augmented reality. So I think, when it comes to getting started, it's just, what are you interested in, and like what kind of work has been done out there? And as David said, where can you kind of find where can you find that surprise and start pulling that thread, I think is key.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. I'll build on that just a little bit and briefly. I'm going to say something that might, I don't know, like if you're trying to work out what media archaeology is for you or what it can do for you, I'll say this: I still don't think we know what it is. In that, like, I think that it is in part a method, right? I think it means so many different things to so many different people that it gets so muddied that if you spend a lot of time trying to figure out what it is, like I did in grad school, you might get sort of lost in that quagmire. And the important thing, like Justin was saying, is to really focus on your objects. And if your method or if your disposition is like getting in the way of your objects, then don't worry about it, right? Just focus on the objects, focus on what you think makes the objects compelling, and try to convey what makes them interesting to you, to your audience. And I think that's sort of at the end of the day, why are we interested in sort of the foundational works in media archaeology? Well, they covered subjects that we find fascinating in ways that made them more fascinating, right? They took something that we thought we understood and they problematized it in a way that left us a little bit unmoored, that made us feel like we needed to try to think about it with fresh eyes. So again, like, this is just to say it might be helpful to like not get bogged down in trying to figure out what media archaeology is and just try to do it. And that's what I've done in my work to just get around that conundrum.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I mean, I think like that really emphasizing that like we don't, really even fully know what media archaeology is. Certainly, I think the Hatamo and Parika book, like Media Archaeology, is a great thing to pick up for people looking to get started. Like it's kind of, as David was saying, like one of the books that people really started to outline what this is. But even within the book, there's kind of a lot of different threads. There's a lot of different ways of doing that. I think of contemporary work, for instance, like Parika's latest work is doing a lot of environmentally oriented stuff and kind of looking at things like minerals, or even think of something like John Durham Peters and the Marvelous Clouds. And like, that's not something that's called media archaeology. He doesn't certainly make the claim that it is, but I certainly think there's a lot of archaeological work being done there. And it certainly gives us a very different and expansive and open and interesting way of thinking about these antecedent technologies, or even just kind of historical antecedents of media, and how it's part of how we sense and experience and move through the world in interesting ways. So yeah, I mean, I'd agree. I think getting bogged down in the method, a lot of times people want it to be a method, right? They want it to be something that they can follow, because critical scholarship, oftentimes it's hard to jump in like that, right? But I think, fundamentally, it's something that is not captured by more social scientific methodologies for a reason, right? And so, I don't know. I think jumping in is a good way to do it.
I'll just say one last thing, because I know we're a little short on time. To Justin's point, find an exemplar, like find a study that you really want to emulate, and just try to do what they did, try to follow their method. So if it's from something that's formally classified as media archaeology, great. If it's from something that's thought of more conventionally as media history, that's also great. But find a model for you to use in your work.
Okay, so I have one more question from the audience, and let's try to keep our answers short because we only have just a couple of more minutes. But I think this is a really fantastic question, and one that I grapple with in my own work. And this comes from Melly Dietrich, who asks about how do we handle or deal with missing data or data that is not present in the archive because of either how the archive is constructed, because of hegemonic structures, dominant cultures, or other such reasons. So what are your last thoughts on this matter?
Okay, let me give a quick answer. This is a fantastic question. It's if I had to identify a weakness in my own work, I would say that there are a lot of things that aren't captured in the archive that my work doesn't find. But I think that the answer that I would give there is to try to grow the archive, right? Like if the archive doesn't cover things that you think should be in it, and there's a methodological thing here about trying to expand the limits of knowledge, and every time you create a new horizon, you define a new outside to seek to expand. So that's the answer that I would give, is just to try to grow. If the archive is non-representative of what you think should be in it, then try to find extra things to put in it to challenge, to challenge that hegemonic structure. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say piggybacking off of that, I think one of the really great things about something like media archaeology and this discontent with linear narratives and these canonized narratives of media is like, a lot of times we think of the emergence of something as like this eureka moment, and often it's part of this sort of like great man theory, right? And I say man, meaning man, right? Like a lot of times our technologies are attributed to one, usually man, usually white man, right? But the reality of that is often quite different, right? There's a lot of people experimenting with technologies across different locations. A lot of times the work of women, of people of color, are very much erased by canonized narratives that want to attribute this like lone genius inventor having this eureka moment. And so I think media archaeology fundamentally can work to retell those stories. And fundamentally, I think there's that justice component that comes along with it in telling better stories, right? Because we're not saying this was just appeared out of thin air, right? There's a lot of lineage. There's different ways where things emerge and reemerge over time. So yeah.
Well, thank you to you both. And I'm so glad that we ended on that note of this idea of expanding and growing the archive and not just taking this eureka moment, because this is so much of what we're doing with the Mobile Gaming Research Lab, is trying to expand an archive of mobile gaming history and trying to understand a history that is longer than the current moment that we currently exist in. So to everyone who has tuned into this lecture series, or this episode of the lecture series, I just want to thank you all for participating and coming along. And on behalf of the Mobile Gaming Research Lab and the North Carolina State Department of Communication, just our deepest gratitude. So for those interested, we will have a recording of this event on the Mobile Gaming Research Lab website, which is mglab.chas.ncsu.edu. And just for some last closing remarks, I would like to hand the microphone over to Dr. D'Souza y Silva.
So Thank you all. I just wanted to kind of close by say, first of all, thank you, Reagan, for moderating this session, and it was such an interesting discussion on the relationships between media archaeology and mobile gaming and history and memory. So I think that kind of grows and kind of points to this important connection and things that we are trying to do with the Mobile Gaming Lab. I just wanted to remind everybody that to contribute to our database that I'm going to put here on the chat link. So if you're interested in knowing more, just go ahead and create an account, and we welcome your suggestions. And also, thank you so much for Justin and David for taking the time and chatting with us. I actually learned a lot as well about media archaeology and memory and the relationship to gaming. So bye, everybody.